lightning talk from Beth Griggs. Handing it over to you, Beth.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Please nod, wave, say yes or something. Yep. Okay, cool. So my lightning talk's just a bit of show and tell on implementing Adoptium Release Notes. So long story, but I came over to do some work, and one piece of work that Shelley said you needed help with was getting some release notes implemented. So I set out to work on that. And this is just going to be, you know, where we started, where we're at, and where we're hoping to be very soon. So next slide. So yeah, TLDR, we want release notes on the Adoptium website, and we've had to figure out how we get them there. So I started by prototyping, you know, from various endpoints, mostly the bugs openjdk.org Jira instance, which does have an RSS feed and then a REST API that we can query. And essentially we look at the fixed version and we can get all of the JDK bugs for that particular fixed version. So what these prototypes were doing were, this was all on the website itself. So at build time, it was querying the RSS feed or the REST feed, pulling in all the data and essentially generating the static HTML with all of the data in it. That was okay as a prototype to try and get some feedback and also just get some information on the screen. But there are some challenges with that going forward. The reason it wasn't dynamically being queried in is because a lot of these endpoints were not cross-origin resource sharing enabled, which means you can't just dynamically pull them in, you know, client side, which would have been nice. So I'll just skim through these prototypes. This was prototype 1 with the RSS feed, slightly more data that we pulled out from the endpoint. So we had the component priority and title. This was the bugs OpenJDK Jira REST endpoint. Worth noting that the plan was that you probably go to Adoptium /release notes and pass a query parameter of the release version, and then it brings up the release notes. That's just how they'd be surfaced. And one of the other prototypes we looked at was Alexi's backports monitor. So he already generates some HTML and also some, I think, text output as well. And I just tried pulling that in to see what it looked like if we just pulled the HTML in its raw form and rendered it. It looked quite nice, but you lose a lot of capabilities doing that because it's much harder to query or, you know, dial because you're just pulling in his HTML form. Also, that wasn't CORS enabled either, so we would have had to have done it at build time. And this was one of the later ones, again, using the Jira REST endpoint. This was more just playing with how we want release notes to look. So we were using a component that allowed us to pull in a table and just populate it with data. And just to show some of the drawbacks of those initial prototypes, a lot of them didn't have CORS enabled. That meant that we had to pull in all this data at build time, which filled up the Gatsby GraphQL endpoint, and that just wouldn't particularly be maintainable going forward because it would just grow indefinitely, eventually slow things down. And also conceptually, you know, it's not the website's job to be storing release notes really. It's its job to render them, but it's not really its job to, you know, store them. So it was nice to have some things on the screen to kind of show what we might get out at the end, but kind of went back to the drawing board. And I think this was based on one of Tim's comments, and we kind of came up with a new approach, which was we actually have a script that's part of the build, where we pass it in OpenJDK version. And what that script will do is go and find the sources, whatever those sources may be, generate the release notes, and we agreed for those to be in JSON form. And then once those release notes are generated, they'll be published as a GitHub asset. So for that particular version, it'll pop up for the under the GitHub release assets, and then the Adoptium website can just fetch them from there and render them from there. We use predictable naming so that we can just pass forward the parameters and pick up the release notes for a given version. So that was a kind of new approach. So I set out to write that little script. Just to share, this was the initial script. I think it's like 40 lines of JavaScript or so, but most of that is comments and space. So not a lot of code to maintain, fortunately, if we can get a good endpoint that can just give us all of this data. So what this was using was the Jira instance, which pulled back all of the JDK bugs for a particular release version. You just give it a release version, it prints out a JSON in a formatted form. My initial cut of what to pull out of the data was ID, title, description, priority, and you can see the rest. There is additional data that we could pull out, but this seemed to be the reasonable set. I was kind of looking at like Fuji and other sources to see what kind of information they normally surface, and this was the similar kind of information. This is kind of the proposed output, and we can code the Adoptium website to render these fields and base it all on that. Once we've got a kind of a contract to what this JSON structure looks like, we can just build from there, so it's not entirely blocked. One thing I noticed during this whole process is when looking at the release notes from all the various sources for the exact same version, for example 17.05, there was different numbers of JDK bugs coming out of each place, and I was counting them. I was, spent a lot of time trying to figure out, why is this source including this particular JDK item and not another one. And this time zone one was a good example. So my script returned it, Alexi's tool returned it. I confirmed that the commit was actually on the branch of what was built, but it wasn't listed in Fuji. So I spent a lot of time the past couple of weeks being like, I have output, but I need to be confident that my output is correct before we go live with this. So that's been, something to figure out the past couple of weeks. And from that, we ended up kind of going through the Git history approach. So because the Git history, where OpenJDK used the commits in a structured form containing the JDK ID, we figured we could cross-reference the Git history between two tags with what the Jira API returns, and then we're essentially confirming this is the list of JDK items that were built in the release, and that seems like the most authoritative source of truth for us to rely on. So the idea is you'd pass the two tags, it'd figure out the difference. We'd then pull out all the JDK numbers and enhance the list with the extra information that Jira gives us about each of these items. I tried to do that in a little mermaid form, so we need two tags being passed. It does the git log. There's some extra commands to filter like merge commits so we don't get the noise there. It produces the list of commits. We then also use the OpenJDK Jira API. That enhances the information, and the output is some release notes in JSON form. There are some caveats here. Some of the commits that I see on the branches are not accessible via the Jira API. I presume those are the ones that are restricted for security reasons, etc. I think that's fine. It's just our release notes won't be able to be enhanced there. We will just have to say, this JDK number was included in the release, this is the commit title, that's it, that's all we can pull in for that. But I think that's fair, especially if we end up getting to the point of having CVE data, which would hopefully plug that gap, because I'm guessing they all match up. So this is the process of what I expect the script to do, and I imagine the script to be part of the build flow. So for each build, this script would happen and spell some JSON at the end. So then really the next steps for me, where we're at is, like currently the script I have isn't doing the Git history traversing and pulling that out, so I need to change the script to do that and start with the list of Git commits, then add the extra data from the Jira API. Then we need to figure out how we slot the script into the Adoptium release pipeline. For now, it could be manual, or it could be just a standalone Jenkins job before we just pass the tags and click build and it spits it out. And then we can move on to updating the website to use this JSON output. What's nice is we'd have our own authoritative source of release notes that align with what we actually built at Adoptium. So that's the plan. And then a big question mark is for CVE data. Haven't found a good source for that yet. We're still looking to see how we can automate CVEs so that we can also post, CVE JSON or a CVE file so people can clearly see, hey, these are the CVEs that were fixed in this release. And that, I see that as an enhancement to our release notes page. You'd want a section at the top or something somewhere saying these are the CVEs fixed, and then a list of other fixed issues elsewhere. So that's it for next steps. I guess one thing that can be done in parallel is if anyone has any ideas on how they would like this to be rendered, because we've tried a few different forms, like the page table, the full list, full text form, the filter table. If anyone has any ideas on what they want this to eventually look like, please propose it somehow. I don't know, wireframe, notes on a paper, just so we can get an idea of what we're aiming for. And also the JSON output. I think I posted that on an issue somewhere. Just to confirm, is this a good set of data to start with? Is there anything obvious that's missing? But I feel like this is a good set to start with. And I've got some links in here as well to show the full JSON forms that I've managed to spit out of my tool. And with that, there's not really much more update other than kind of know where we're heading. If anyone has any feedback on that approach, please share it now, I guess.
Well, I think
that's the right approach.
Yeah,
Sorry,